All right, we are live, and this is welcome to, I don't know what the 11th Bible study that we've had, and this is on the book of Ruth. So just again, I don't know if you've all taken lots of showers to get the book of Judges off your minds, and but you're just to sort of, again, to recap the whole journey of what's going on. You have creation, and then you have sort of a recreation in Noah, and you have covenants that sort of hinge on both of those, both to be fruitful and multiply. So the Adamic covenant and the Noahic covenant, this is just when it was just God and creation. There was no separate people. And then you have the covenant established with Abraham after the time of Noah and the reestablishment of civilization. It was still going south in God's opinion. So he established a covenant with someone he found decent, and the guy's name was Abram and Sarai, and they eventually became known as Abraham and Sarah, the father of three major and predominant religions in the world, actually. Abraham is the father, again, of Christianity, or Judaism, Christianity, but also Islam. It's an important thing to remember, just that Abraham fathered Ishmael, who was the founder of Islam. I don't mean to imply anything by that, just to be clear either. I just think it's important to hold, and that there's a similar background or similar origin. And then you have the development of Abraham's line, and that went through Abraham, and then Isaac, with Esau and Isaac, and then Jacob, and Jacob with his mother Rebekah, who deceived Isaac to get the birthright, and ultimately then is responsible for the 12 tribes, one being established through Joseph and his 12 brothers. And they sold him to slavery in Egypt, and Joseph went to Egypt and then found favor there, and was responsible for helping to bring the Israelites to Egypt. Whereas they grew in number and in prosperity, they were eventually enslaved by the Egyptians, and they spent over 400 years there in slavery. God brought out Moses, who was born into the Egyptian line, and then rescued the people, and then they crossed over through the book of Exodus into across the Red Sea, and then established themselves at the base of Mount Sinai, where God gave them the 10 Commandments and gave them a tribe of the Levites, and then they had some disobedience in there, and they wandered the desert for 40 years. And then before crossing over, Moses gives his farewell, and Joshua prepares the people, and they cross over into what we now know as what they knew as the Promised Land, and is modern day Israel. While they were settled there, they did not conquer all of the Canaanites, but instead subdued them into slavery, or brought them into their own lines. And so you have a series then of many years represented in the book of Judges that goes through the good kings and the bad kings, and the judges that basically were there to bring God's judgment on the people. And that's where we ended last week, that season of the first sort of stretch of the Israelite occupation of the land and their disobedience, and God's working in faithfulness in that and moving in them, but really to a place where they were, when they disobeyed, they brought calamity into their lives, and when they obeyed, they brought God's blessing. Now, that led through all the different judges and up to the point where we have now this next book of Ruth. And we had talked about that before, and I think Glenda brought that up, about the fact that there are these Deuteronomic texts, and that would be Deuteronomy, that would be Samuel's, that would be Judges, and there are all these sort of things that deal with the formation of God's people, with the laws that surround them. Now, Ruth does not fall into that category. It is of that time period, but does not actually fall into the category of doing the same thing. And it is actually thought that Ruth was something that happened chronologically during this period, which would have been around probably like the 5th or 4th century BC. And the reason for that is, I'll come to that in a second, but the reason that's important is that the story where it's placed was probably much earlier, but there's evidence that the story was compiled and written and formed that has some reflection sort of a written as a past story or event. So it is, and it is grouped in what we call the writings. So you have the Pentateuch, or the Torah. You have, and then you have the Deuteronomic texts that deal with law. And now we're into these writings, and Psalms and Proverbs, and those sort of things are the smaller books, are in that grouping of writings. And Ruth falls into that. It originally was grouped much later, and then eventually found its way chronologically in where it would have been in the flow of the narratives. And part of that, the reason they put it there, and the question becomes, is this something that was added later or something that was represented in the original manuscripts? But as you start in Ruth chapter 1, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, and that sort of has the same linguistic qualities as what we saw in Judges, where it said that days of rule there was no king. And so there's that sense of time placement by simple introductory phrases. And so because of that sense of this was after the time of Judges, that's why we're looking at it right now. So chronologically speaking, this is where it would have been written. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions, and then we'll move forward. So that's a little bit of the background of its placement. Okay. A little about the book as a whole. I and a couple of things that I've kind of found that was interesting. Well, one, again, the writing of the time is something that it shouldn't be overlooked. That sense of being not only familiar with the judges, but there was a sense of occupation and post-exile movement that happened after Nehemiah and Ezra, which is kind of when after this is dated. And what you have here, and I should have, let me see if I have a piece of paper here that I can. And this is going to be very crude and not, so this is kind of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea down here. And then you have the Mediterranean over here. And so this is modern day Israel on this side. So this is Mediterranean over here, and modern day Israel is here. And so Bethlehem is somewhere, let's say around here. And these folks were from Bethlehem that we're going to look at in Ruth. And just the movement, so you understand where we're going in this, the movement of it is they went from Bethlehem, and it says right in the beginning, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah. And again, what you should know now is that by this time they had kind of divided the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom was, I guess I didn't draw it right, was the northern kingdom was Israel, and the southern kingdom was Judah. So they were in the northern kingdom, or the southern kingdom of, which is where it is now, in Bethlehem, which is where Jesus was born. And because there was a famine, they go and they come over here to basically what is east of the Galilee and the Dead Sea and all of, and what we know now as modern day Israel. So they went over here to the land of Moab. Why? Because there was no food, and they had to go somewhere. And so they deserted this town, and some commentators pointed out to the fact that there's some irony in that, because Bethlehem is called is the meaning of Bethlehem is food or bread, that they had to leave. And so they go from Bethlehem over here to Moab, and then they hang out in Moab for a while. And then, as we'll learn, the Naomi's husband dies, and then her 2 sons dies, and then she's left with these 2 women, and they don't know what to do. And one of them stays in this Moabite area, and then they actually come back here to come back to Israel. So they return back home. So they make this sort of loop. and they come back. And that's significant because, again, Moabites were not good people. And in fact, one of the things that I think is interesting about the Moabites is if you go back to Genesis 19, you have Genesis 19 is about the depravity of Sodom. So you're looking at some of the darkest times right now in early civilization, and you have I don't know if you remember the story. I won't go into great detail, but Lot, as you remember, I don't know, that he had two daughters, and they wanted to continue on Lot's line. So basically, they got him drunk 2 nights in a row, and both of his daughters had relations with him. And the older daughter that did in the first night gave birth to Moab, who was the founder of the Moabites. So because that nation was established through incestual relationships, there was a big problem, and they became sort of this wicked people group. So even the fact that they, as Israelites, moved to Moab to escape the famine is almost an abandonment, in some sense, of identity, in the sense of going into another person's territory, land to try to find. And then when those male figures died, and we'll talk about those relationships shortly, then when they moved back, they were returning back to the roots of Naomi at the time. What else?
Was it, Jason, was it difficult for a family line to stay in one location for as long as that line of David was located there in Bethlehem? I mean, that was always, it just had been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Was that typical?
Well, I mean, there are periods of Israel's exile, and then and also occupation, and so it become like anything. I mean, like any land, there always is the challenges of when you're driven out, or when you occupy the land and someone else is the rule. You know, I mean, like for the time of Jesus when the Romans ruled. I mean, there, you know, that sense of the Israelites. Okay, Carla, thanks. The Israelites, you know, that's why this sense of land and ownership, that's why it's so you know, it's so important to the understanding of who the Israelites are. Again, in that sort of Palestine Israelite occupation or challenge, or, you know, wrestling over the land, you know, this is something that goes back thousands of years, and so there's so much of it's tied, and it's tied to that covenantal promise of God giving them that land. So, which is why we generally, as you know, historically, we've been largely a Christian nation. We've sided with the Israelites in large part because of that. Is because we view that as their land. That it doesn't mean the Israelites have always handled it well, or of the Palestinians for that matter. But quite frankly, you show me a nation that's handled conflict well, and you can fill in the blank after. The problem with the world is there are people in it, and we're all depraved. But no, I think there was a lot of migration and a lot of movement, and that doesn't say there aren't families that have maybe can trace their roots back, you know, generation after generation to certain lands. But I do think, and there's evidence in Ruth that upon Naomi and Ruth's return, there was, I mean, it says that, I think it says in the beginning of chapter 2 that there was a sense of commotion. And so you got to think, well, Bethlehem A is not that big of a town. It's pretty small in the whole, and it would have been smaller back then, but even in present day, Bethlehem is not very big. So that knowledge of their return would have been something significant, because they basically had abandoned their people to go try to find a way to survive. So there was no expectation that Naomi would have ever returned, let alone with a daughter-in-law who was a Moabite, who was considered this, like, you know, that's like Samaritan in the New Testament. Okay. What else? In general, you'll see that what the interesting fact that God is barely mentioned, like Esther's God's not mentioned at all. God is mentioned referentially, and God is known, but this is not a book that is really promoting a doctrine of who God is in explicit terms. Now, there are some thoughts around the whole book and how it functions, and actually to the extent that we'll talk about it a little bit later, but It was even suggested that it might have been an apologetic, and then this goes back to the dating of its compilation or its sort of establishment in the Torah, but that the time that it was established, there was questions about marrying foreigners and those outside of the nation of Israel. And this could have, there are some that think this could have been in the 4th century an apologetic for basically saying, look, there was a precedent set back in biblical times after the Judges where God used this interracial or intertribal or whatever you want to marriage, marrying a foreigner and having it be actually a blessing. Because the interesting thing about it is, we'll find is that again, and if you haven't read Ruth for a while, that Ruth becomes she is the mother, who basically the mother of Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, who leads all the way through Mary's line. So and what's interesting about that is the genetic side, and although it's said to come through Abimelech's, the husband who died of Naomi's, although it's said to come through his line, it never really did in the same way, because he wasn't a part of it. It was a Moabite. It was half Moabite blood and Boaz's blood that led to ultimately to David. Now, that doesn't really make a huge difference, but for those who want to say, hey, it's okay to marry someone outside of our tribal or ethnic understanding, there is this sort of precedent case that is set in the book of Ruth. Just as an interesting side note. The story is generally about a number of things, and as we talk about it, you might want to look through it one of these lenses. And that is Naomi's sense of God's care of Naomi. You have this sort of Naomi's following her husband. They go to Moab, and then her husband dies and her sons dies, and she's left there. And this wasn't like there was a 401k and a retirement fund to fall back on. It was like she was hosed. And so it was God's care. And so the book in the first, and there's a parallelism in that first chapter of the book, it's sort of like anguish and this heartache that's happened to Naomi. She's an Israelite. And then there's this redemption on the other side of that in chapter 4. And that basically God cares for one of the Israelites through the love of a foreigner or a Moabite woman, being Ruth's care for her. So we'll look at that. There's the sort of theme of Ruth's salvation and the fact that this Gentile, this Moabite woman, so a foreigner and a woman and of lowly status, becomes ultimately the saving sort of hinge on this line that leads to David. And then really Boaz has a deep sense of compassion, and his and really beyond. I mean, like you don't get too many characters who don't have flaws in the Bible. Boaz might border on one of them, and his character is known. So in some sense, you could say Naomi's care is Israel, and Boaz is sort of functioning as this caregiver or godlike figure. But Boaz is caring for Naomi, ultimately cares in the larger narrative of God. But the salvation and the broader nature of that really comes through Ruth, which I think is interesting. Again, we'll look at these themes all sort of come together. But let me, it makes me think, how familiar are you with the story? Would it be good for me? I mean, you just show of hands, there's no shame. Do you want me to do just a quick overview before we get into the chapters so you can kind of see the flow of the narrative?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Sure.
And admittedly, and don't feel bad if you don't, because Ruth is one of those that it's been years since I've studied it. There's a lot of similarities in terms of Esther as well. But Ruth, again, is a story of. So you have the Israelites living in what was Canaan. And so they're dwelling there, and famine occurs. So this is after all the times of Judges. You have several hundreds, maybe a couple 150 years, 120, 150 years, whatever and then you have a famine that comes. And so you have this Israelite family, and the guy's name, the husband's name was Elimelech, and he takes his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Malon and Chilion, or Chillin, as it looked like Chillin, remind me of the restaurant here, so we'll call them Chillin. And they go and they basically jump ship from Bethlehem and go over to Moabite, and that's over on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. And while they're there, the sons now do something they really shouldn't, which is marry Moabite women. And one of them is Orpah, and the other is Ruth. And they're Moabite women, so they just by the fact that they moved there, and that they probably weren't like going over there for a time period. They're probably planning on staying there. And so in some sense, even in the sense of Elimelech leaving, there was a sense of abandoning his people in the promised land and going to somewhere where they thought there was a chance of survival. So and although that's not discussed, that fact is still he was abandoning the promised land in favor of trying to go and try to find a better life. And so you can't fault him for that. But ultimately it leads to the continuation of the salvation of Israel, of the Moabites in the story in a Israelite occupation. Oh, another thing I was to say is Orpah was the other woman who, I don't know, they didn't say who married who. I was trying to figure it out, who was belonged to who. But Orpah was the other woman. So Ruth and Orpah eventually. So during this, let me pause here for a second. Orpah actually was what Oprah's name originally was. Her mom named her Orpah after Orpah in the Bible. But no one, like, they reversed the letters, and she grew up being called Oprah because people didn't really understand that it was Orpah. And so Oprah Winfrey, as we know her today, her legal name, I don't know if she ever changed it, but her original name, and she talks about this, was Orpah. So also I found out that she's worth 2.5 billion, which kind of is gross, but good for her, I guess. At least she's doing some good things with it, hopefully. Okay, so so what happens then is they marry these folks, and then the dad, Elimelech, dies, and Naomi is now a widow, but she still has two sons that would care for her, so it was not of a concern. But as time goes on, her two sons die, and now she's left there with Orpah and Ruth. And she doesn't know what to do. So she basically says, I'm headed back to Bethlehem, and I got to make this journey because there's no one of, there was a law that came into that time that said, basically, if you die, if I had a brother and he died, I would then marry his widow and offer care for her. But they were in Moab, so that wasn't going to happen. So there was a sense of, well, she was going to return, and she tells the girl, her daughters-in-law, to stay. And this comes to probably one of the most famous statements, and I'll read that for you. And it's in chapter 1. It says, "So she said," meaning Naomi said to Ruth, "So you see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, the Moabites, and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you, nor to turn back from following you. Where you will go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. And so you have this sense of this Moabite woman who basically is forced, and she had her mother and her father still there, so she had someone to go back to. But for whatever reason, she betrothed herself to Naomi. So Naomi takes her, and they go back, and they arrive in Bethlehem, and they create quite a stir, and then and they're having to survive there, Elimelech didn't have any sort of brothers immediately to sort of take care of Naomi and Ruth. So Naomi sends Ruth down to the to glean the fields. And this goes back to a practice that was established in Levitical law that said that you leave food, you don't pick up all the little grains off the ground. Leave them there for folks to be able to pick up, for the poor, basically. And so Ruth becomes a gleaner in the field, and someday Boaz just happens to come up on his horse, and you can kind of imagine him trotting up, and there are his workers there, and the gleaners are there, and he fancies the beauty of Ruth, and inquires about her, and is impressed by her industrious nature of picking up the grains, and ultimately shows her favor, to the extent of even saying to the workers, leave her alone, like she's not to be harassed, and invites her in to share in one of their communal meals, and they have this meal together. And then Ruth goes back to her mother-in-law and tells her this whole story, and Ruth's like, well, I don't know, and I don't know what the time sequence was, but says that, well, Boaz is actually my kin. We're related. So she says, go to him, and workers would stay at the threshing floor to protect the grain. So threshing floor is where they gathered it and they processed it, the grain. And so the workers would have stayed there. And so that sense of being on the threshing floor, basically what happens is Naomi tells Ruth to go lay herself at the foot of Boaz's bed. And this is where it gets a little like, a little scandalous, but she lays herself, but not really. She lays herself at his feet and says, basically, cover me, and which means she's asking for protection. He fancies her. He says, okay, but I need to make sure that everything's kosher. And I don't think there was any relations that night. He wasn't doing anything that he shouldn't have. But the next day he goes and he finds that there was a next of kin that's closer in relation to Naomi, and so he goes and checks with them, and the guy, for a number of reasons, doesn't really want to deal with it and says, no, you can have her. And so basically, because Boaz clears it with this other guy, he now can then marry Ruth, and they have a child, again, Obed, and it carries on the line of Elimelech through Naomi's connection to Ruth, but also Boaz's line through Ruth as the mother of Obed. And so what you have then is this redemption story that sort of is in chapter 4 that reverses this whole narrative that began with chapter 1 and sort of this famine and the loss of husbands and sons and this devastation, returning to a place of not only establishing Naomi's line and as being safe and cared for and nurtured and brought back into the house of Israel, but in fact, the incorporation of this foreigner, to the extent that foreigner has a direct influence on on the successive line of David. So now I can go through each one of these. I'll go through the chapters and we'll look at sort of breakdown, but that's kind of the whole narrative. There's a dealing with the famine, loss of husbands and sons, returning to Bethlehem with Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, winning favor with Boaz, her kin from a few degrees separation, and the marrying of Ruth and Boaz, which led to the line of Jesse and David. So
Jason, I've got a question.
What's that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you get the feeling or the sense that Elimelech was being punished in some form or fashion for taking his family over to a country that had false gods, wild camels, and fast women, and it was a kind of a wild country as compared to, and then letting his sons take on Moab wives? It almost looks like, with all three of them dying like that, it's almost like it was destiny for going over there.
Perhaps. There's nothing in the text that would sort of indicate that. You have basically, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, you have just sort of the quick narrative of it's about as brief as a narrative setup you're going to get. And it basically sort of establishes when the judges ruled, there was a famine, and they were in Bethlehem, and they left Bethlehem and went to Moab, and they married some Moabites, and then they all died, except for the women.
Then it turns into a love story where Ruth is actually taking care of her mother-in-law. It's not the typical mother-in-law story.
No, and we shouldn't underestimate Ruth's proclamation of allegiance and love and loyalty to Naomi, because there was no reason for her to do that. It wasn't as if Moabites were like living in famine or anything themselves. I mean, they were in the same probably general, it's the same region of the world. They're probably dealing with the same sort of things, but she didn't have to go with Naomi. But for whatever reason, there was this deep, profound love in her that drew her to Naomi to say that she would forsake her God. She would forsake the gods of the Moabites. She would forsake her family. Like she was like, and in that regard, she's looked at as somewhat of a, going back to that thing about the possible apologetic for marrying foreigners, the argument against that apparently was that she was a proselyte. She actually converted to Judaism, so she was no longer a Jew. So when Boaz married her, that her confession to, or her proclamation of allegiance to Naomi was essentially her proselytization or her commitment to Judaism, allowing really Boaz marrying her was not him marrying a foreigner, but actually an Israelite. And again, the funny thing about it is, like, you're talking about the Middle East. It wasn't like, the Moabites were like white people, and the Amorites were black people, and the Jews, like they were all Middle Easterns. Like for all intents and purposes, you could put a Moabite next to an Israelite, next to an Amorite, next to a Canaanite. You probably wouldn't be able to tell much difference. So in other words, there was a cultural association, and the worship of one's God was one of those major factors. So for Ruth to say, I'm denying the whole cosmological structure of what, and honestly, and the Moabites would have probably, and I don't really know much about the Moabites, but I would, like many other tribal groups at the time, they probably were polytheistic. There were multiple gods. So she was rejecting the notion of this cosmology of polytheism and the multiple gods and everything that she had known and she was going off with this woman who was her mother-in-law to a land that she's hated by. Again, they were established through ancestral relations. So there was this abhorrence towards the Moabites that she knew she was going in, but she came in as one. And later in the book, we see that Boaz actually knows, or it indicates that he's aware of the story of her allegiance. And so he knows what he's getting into. He knows that she's a Moabite, but she's a Israelite convert.
You have really won the respect of people in the town by the way she has treated Naomi, because Boaz makes reference to that a couple of times, of how kind she's been to Naomi. And what does he say about her? I'll do what you have asked. You are respected by everyone in this town, he says to her. So apparently, there was some kind of a really close bond between her and Naomi. She must have seen something in Naomi that would have caused that kind of an attachment to form.
The relationship between Ruth and Naomi is only, I would say, in terms of women relationships, that passage or that relationship has been characterized or personified or epitomized through history. In the same way, David's relationship with Jonathan has been sort of a characteristic or an exemplification of friendship. So no doubt, this is a love story, but not one of romantic love, but one of deep, profound love that sacrifices everything of who one is for the sake of the other. So, and ultimately ends up being that source of redemption. Donna.
I'm wondering, where you see this verse, and your God will be my God. To me, that says something about Naomi's witness to Ruth about her God, and that Ruth wanted to embrace that God. To me, that bond is also connected with God in this. This is about the only time you hear about him, but there must have been something that Naomi witnessed to Ruth about God.
Well, and the same, the irony of that is that we're all talking about them abandoning, Bethlehem and going, to the Moabites. And so there was a sense of disobedience, yet there is a sense of this allegiance from this Moabite woman. And again, she has no reason, but there is, and actually, now that you say that, in verse 17, it says, where you die, I'll die. There will I be buried. May the Lord, and if you have an NRSV translation, I'm not sure what you all have, you can shout it out, but mine says, may the Lord, all caps, do thus, and so to me, and more as well. Do you all have the Lord or some version of that?
Yeah, mine says the Lord.
And remember,
and the Lord deal with me ever severely if
Right.
anything but death separates us. So she must have had a little relationship with God too, if she calls him the Lord.
Well, and I think that's actually, and commentators say that's actually a pretty significant reference, because she is using the tetragram, those letters, and if the NRSV will place Lord in all caps where you have the word Yahweh, because Jews won't say it. So her acknowledgement, and now whether she actually said the name or not, but her acknowledgement of this God by name was significant. So the fact that she was in that statement committing herself to the existence of Yahweh, and her servitude to him.
And maybe that's perhaps why God let her be in the line of the Savior. Why would she be one of the ancestors of Jesus? Maybe that faith, that little kernel of faith that she had, what he honored.
It's like Rahab too. Rahab is included in the genealogy. So you have these Gentile women who have been inserted into the narrative, which makes sense to us as Gentiles, and that's the challenge. The challenge we have really as Christians is, anytime we look at these Old Testament texts, there's always the tendency to look at it through that Christological lens. It says, I'm a Christian. The whole book is about us. It's all about us and our existence. And we forget to recognize that these books and this story belong to another people as well. And to them, they're not looking at it through the same redemptive, sense of Christ as being the figure of the culmination of the story. They're still waiting for that culmination in some sense. All right. Let's carry on in verse, unless there's any other thoughts. Let's carry on. Okay. All right. You go down to verse 19. It says, so the two went on until they came to Bethlehem. So the two journey. Imagine a woman, I don't know how old she was at the time, but and her daughter-in-law, who probably could have been more than her teens or 20s, were traveling through from one side all the way to the other. They didn't have a boat to ferry to take them across. They were going all around that giant body of water and making their way over. And they made their way to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And there was a sense of, was this Naomi the one who left? The one who abandoned us, the one who looked for greener pastures, the one who went to the Moabites? And there was, I think, this probably the closest parallel I could think of is if someone has sort of left, on the Amish community, and there's a sense of leaving, and when you're leaving, you're shunning the community because of your departing. And Naomi really wants to reestablish herself. So she says, call me no longer Naomi, but Mara, which means bitterness, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, meaning she had a husband, she had 2 sons. They were going away to a better land where they could feed themselves. They found her life was full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? So she's attempting to reestablish herself. And she said, but when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. So Naomi returned with Ruth to the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. It's like they're trying to reemphasize again the Moabite. It's that like that passage when Moses is getting the second commandments made, and God's like, I got to remake the commandments, the ones that you broke, Moses. The ones that you threw down and broke, Moses. And so there's a lot of, so there's this re-emphasis in the text of these little details, and it shouldn't, They returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, so disconnected, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to the Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So and that's kind of one. One sets up the stage. It establishes the drama, the death. It covers this large period of time and a very small amount of material, and then ultimately starts the real redemptive part, which brings them back to Bethlehem. And this is where Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, so she knew the connection there. And she said to her daughter, because she would be the one to help provide, go into the fields and follow the reapers, and collect their grain. And that sense of gleaning again goes back to Deuteronomy 24, 19 through 21. You see that established as being something that the Israelites should do. And again, there's that sense of caring for the other, the poor, the foreigner, that sense of not everything that we have belongs to us, but there's some that belong to others. And again, and just to kind of put that into perspective, gleaning was no easy task. You're talking about when they're taking the main part of the wheat or the barley or the grain, and you're talking about the little bits and pieces of grains that in the rustling of it have fallen to the ground. So this is like, fine dexterity sort of activity, picking up stuff. Then you have in chapter 2, you have this sense of just as Boaz came in chapter 2, verse 4, just as Boaz came from Bethlehem, he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you," and they answered, "The Lord bless you." And again, they're Yahweh, and so there's a sense of this is the context is again outside of Bethlehem or around Bethlehem, and in Israelite promised land. And he says to the servant in charge, "Whom does this young woman belong to?" So he takes an interest in her, and it says she's a Moabite who came back from Naomi. So there's no secret about who she is. And then she pleads and she says, "Let me stay. Let me gather behind the reapers." And he shows her favor. And then he basically says, don't bother her, leave her alone. And he said, and she says in verse 10, "Why have I found favor in your sight? You should take notice of me. I am a foreigner." But Boaz answers her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." Now, if you want to look at this through a Christocentric lens, you would say that there is a parallel between us abandoning everything as a Gentiles, us abandoning everything we know, even that sense of our mother and our father and our country and our traditions. And there's this sense of that holistic giving of oneself over. That really is echoed again in the New Testament when it talks about discipleship, and again manifests itself in much of 20th century literature in terms of what's called neo-orthodoxy. There's a movement that came up or the early part of the 20th century that really re-emphasized this sense of the totality of Christianity and consuming one's identity. And a lot of that actually comes out of the stuff that happened around World War II. You have Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth and the Confessing Church movement that happened during that time. And again, in times of peril or tragedy or turmoil or horror, these sort of things come to fruition, and we start to really take seriously what those commitments mean. So 14, they go to have dinner. "Come here and eat some bread with us. Dip your morsels of sour wine." And then he protects her, and so she gleaned the field until evening. And then her mother-in-law says to her, "Where did you glean today?" She tells her she was with Boaz. They make the connection, and then she says, and then that leads us to chapter 3, where Boaz and Ruth have this conversation at the threshing floor. And you have this sense of really, and what's interesting about this is there is a calculating side of this that is reminiscent somewhat of Rachel and Jacob going back to Isaac. and the trickery of Isaac, but with a much different sense. This is not the sense of trickery, but still that sense of plotting, of saying, what does this mean? What is it? How do you go about providing and making that connection in a way that, and it's not deception, mind you, because there's nothing being deceived, but there's that sense of plotting or planning. And so what you have then is you have this divine sort of sovereignty plan, and you have these human elements that change the outcome or affect the outcome or intersect with that. Again, that contributing to that idea that although we serve a sovereign God, there still is human agency, and we still do and act according to our own sense of will. And God works with that. In Ruth 3, you kind of have the story of Ruth in making that connection with Boaz. And it says that she came, and I like how it says stealthily too in the NRSV. So 3:6, after her mom sends her down, or her mother-in-law sends her down there. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was content in a contented mood, he went down to lie at the end of a heap of grain. So there was that sense of he made a bed for himself at the end of the grain, again, because they were protecting the grain from people stealing it. From one commentator said that they would have slept around it because the wind was there. So they might have had some sort of tarp that laid over it, and they were there just to make sure the tarp didn't come loose, because this was, grain was the main, barley and grains were some of the main stable sources of food that were meant to be, to survive through the colder months. At midnight, the man, then she came and stealthily uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. And he said, first of all, do you ever think about that? Like, their feet must not have been clean. Like, they weren't like, hey, let's take a little bath after a hard day's labor. They were like out there, and they probably didn't have nice toenail clippers either. So I just can't imagine, laying down at someone's feet and have to, that's kind of like youth group trips after 2 weeks in a van,
But Jason,
Yeah.
Was it the case that this was kind of a ritual that a woman
Yes.
could perform, that if she was going to ask for protection from this, didn't they call them kinsman redeemers?
Yes, they call them kinsman redeemer, and we'll get to that theme of redeemer at the end, because it's used actually. I think that the word redeemer or a derivative of it in Hebrew is used 20 times in the 80-some verses that occupy the whole book of Ruth. So the theme of redemption or redeemer is a strong theme that comes through this book. And redeemer, I'll just say it now, the redeemer is looked at as in two ways. One, there's the redemption of the loss of something. You lose something, and then you're redeemed, and something is restored. The other sense is in the sense that you're talking about, Glenn, the sense of kinship. And it related to the redeemer was then the figure that took, again, what I mentioned earlier, would sort of redeem or take on the responsibility of someone who had lost a husband, a kin who had lost. And typically it would be brother would be the first sort of expression of that. But then there was a line that followed. So that was the connection of saying, hey, go do this. It represents that and the strange thing about this is, as a Moabite woman, she did not really this, that would have been more accustomed to someone within the same tribe, let alone someone from an outside tribe. So this is what made it so, and this is where that idea of her being a proselyte, that she was she was still referred or referentially understood as a Moabite, but there was a knowledge of her kindness and commitment and loyalty to not only Naomi, but to Judaism as a whole. So, she says, spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord. And again, this is just, Boaz is nothing but an upstanding guy. My daughter, the last instance of your loyalty is better than the first, and you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. So there was this acknowledgement of her worth within that culture and her loyalty to that. And he was willing to take her on because of that. And what's interesting about that is that sense of, where is it? In Boaz. I didn't write down the verse, but there's a mention of this covering that Boaz talks about, and then she actually then her request is to cover. So that sense of no, that's where it is. So she lay at his feet.
Verse 9.
Is it verse 9? Who are you? He said, I am the servant. Maybe.
So spread the edge of your cover over me.
Yes, that's where does it say that in verse 9?
Yeah, the end of verse
Oh yeah,
9.
spread your cloak. Yes, thank you. And then he says later that he bring your cloak and wearing out and hold it. And she held it and measured 6 inches of barley. And so there's this recurring theme of this cloak of covering that runs through this. And Boaz talks about the sense of covering. And again, this is not about this book has occasionally been twisted into more of the sexual relationships between the two of them, but really this book is ultimately more about protection than it is about the union between the two, because really at this time, I mean, the sheer fact that if your brother had died and you took on his wife demonstrates that polygamy was fairly common at this time. It wasn't as if, so the idea that one man would, and honestly that led to David had lots of wives, so did Solomon. It was one of the pitfalls they had, but so there was that sense of she became one of his wives, or one, and actually there's indication of that earlier when that sense there, the idea that Ruth's father was probably had a group of wives as well. Okay. But in this chapter, you kind of have the climax of that. You at this point you're feeling good about this. And it says that he basically went on and to try to find out there was a next of kin that was closer. So you have this sort of almost thwarting of the possibility of this wonderful little love relationship or protective narrative come about. And then the guy who didn't want to do it says, nah, that's okay. I'm not really interested. And it results in him being able to marry Ruth in the final chapter. The fourth chapter. And again, this is one of the small, I don't know if I said that, 4 chapters, making it one of the smallest books of the Bible. Okay, so themes that run through this. Oh, and then, the last from 4:13 to 18 is the genealogy. So Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife. The Lord made her conceive. She bore a son. They named him Obed. He gave birth to Jesse, or fathered Jesse, who fathered David. Again, that sense of that lineage. So there's that sense of divine reversal, that the blood of Jesus, the blood of this Messiah, the blood of this Israelite Savior, came from a woman of a foreign land, and one that was despised. So there's that strong divine reversal. There's this strong theme of loyalty that you see that come through the whole thing. And this movement from tragedy and death to joy and birth. And so that's that redemptive narrative. Hello, Linda. That goes in chapter 1, where you have the death and sort of this sort of setup for the story. And then you have the narrative that sort of holds it together. And then at the end, and then one of the commentators I thought was interesting, and I don't know how much emphasis to put into it, but I had that in the middle 2 chapters, each of the chapters kind of go through a plan, in an encounter, and then a dialogue that came out of that between Ruth and Naomi. So there's this movement of there's this plotting or this planning, and then the execution of that plan, and then the debriefing of this plan. And again, these are within Hebrew literature. They didn't just throw stories out or facts out. I mean, there are some that are more historical than others, but so much of the emphasis of Hebrew poetry and the use of words were captured. And you have that parallelism where this is a story of redemption. And they set it up in it's again, that's 4 chapters. It's so small, it's so tight, it barely mentions God, but and God is not a divine actor in that. You don't see God orchestrating this. You don't see God as moving this or changing this or meddling in the life of this. You have God as a sort of side figure, which is an interesting facet both for theologians as well. And I think, and also there are many times where people have said, okay, what does this actually mean? And I think if it wasn't for the connection, if Ruth wasn't connected to the line of Christ, I question whether or not it would have made it in here. because that is where the significance ultimately lies, that beyond the boundaries of Israel, beyond this covenant with this chosen people, that God not only, like Rahab, not only incorporates foreigners or Gentiles into the story narrative, but sets the stage much later for those connections to be meaningful, and allowing those early Jewish Christians of sort of post-Christ to be able to more readily reinterpret and accept the nature of these books and the nature of the inclusion of the Gentiles and the redemption of creation. All right, I think that's it. That's all I got.
That was good.
Is that helpful?
Yep,
Makes
that was
sense?
good.
Yes.
Very good.
Sorry, I didn't time that very well.
All right, we recorded it, and we're going to test you on it next
Oh,
week.
good. Okay, you do that. You
I
do
thought
that.
many times about doing a quiz, but I was like, yeah, no one likes a quiz. Yeah, Donna.
I might tell you one little story. In my grandmother's bedroom in Lake City, there's a picture that hangs on the wall, and it's of a woman, and it's in gilded frame and everything. It's been there since I was a little girl. And I finally asked my mother, because somebody said, is that a relative or something? I finally asked my mother, what is that picture? And she says, that's Ruth.
Ruth.
And she's holding some wheat in her arms, which I never noticed. So we're probably the only one that has a picture of Ruth in their bedroom.
Well, and what you're actually holding is not wheat, it's barley.
Barley.
And for those of you doing yesterday was our barley stocks for the reading. So it's kind of fun to have that overlap with where we're at now. Any other thoughts or comments? It's a nice juxtaposition after Judges, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of like you feel bad and then you feel good, and then I won't say it gets completely better, but from this point forward, before you had Judges juxtaposed with Samuel, and so Ruth's insertion in there gives a nice little historical break because when we pick up Samuel, you're getting back into that sense of Judges transition to Kings, transition to King David. So this is like a vignette in the narrative of this whole thing.
Sort of a nice little breather.
It is,
Yes.
and a nice one to have an Advent before. No one wants. If we left off Judges, for those of you who weren't here last week, go read Judges, and you'll understand why we're talking about it.
Well, Jim was saying, can you imagine a movie based on the book of Judges?
They did Samson. It was one of my favorite movies as a kid.
I know, but all the battles, I mean, it's just like one battle after another. Compared to a movie made on this book would be wonderful.
And there have been. I've seen those too. It was not my favorite ones, but like I said, if they've made a biblical movie about anything, I've seen it.
I like this one because it's a grandmother's story too.
It is.
Because it ends on that note about Naomi loved the boy. When Ruth and Boaz had a son, Naomi loved the boy and took good care of him. I mean, it's just kind of like, it ties the whole story together from when she lost her husband and her own sons, and then she is blessed with this grandson in the end, and it has a nice resolution.
It does. And I will say again, what I thought was interesting was that when they list, when I go back to it, I already closed my book. When they list it and they go back to it, they actually when they list the genealogy. Where is it? They actually draw the line or the connection back to Abimelech's, not to Ruth or to Naomi's. But Boaz is still in the mix. But basically, Naomi's Abimelech's line was represented through, despite the fact that there wasn't a genetic connection. I mean, kinship as a whole, but not direct genetic line.
My Bible says at the end of that verse, Naomi loved the boy and took good care of him. The neighborhood women named him Obed, but they called him Naomi's boy. It's just like such a beautiful, like her there too. It's her restoration. for all that
Yep.
she has lost. She's given this child who kind of,
The son had been born to Naomi. In other words, that was from the line of her and Abimelech's, even though it wasn't.
right.
Yep. And the descendants are Perez, became the father of Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab of Nahshon of Solomon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. And again, that sense of the Jesse tree that we're doing, that sense of connection to the whole narrative as a whole. So it's a lovely story
Right.
of friendship, of loyalty, of God's provision, of the inclusion of foreigners, of kindness shown. I mean, it's one of the books that really doesn't have a lot of bad stuff in it. We probably, really in terms of biblical characters too, Naomi's the kind of crank of the whole thing. But you have this foreigner Naomi, and then you have Boaz, and again, upstanding. It's just sort of it's your feel good after school special. So
Kind of like a Hallmark movie.
It's a kind of Christmas,
Hallmark, yeah,
Christmas story though.
it's a Christmas story. All right, anything else? Any other thoughts? 4 chapters lends itself to less exegesis probably, so we're ending a little there's probably less to poke around at, and there's less to wrestle with. I mean, this is one of those stories that, again, we've just had how many 7 books of the formation of a people, but God not always looking great. So this is a nice little break to sort of a shift in the transition. And again, it shifts again. Now we're going to see the beginning of the establishment of the Davidic kingdom, which is always good because we know the promise of that is there.
Nothing next week, and then coming.
All right. Any other thoughts or questions?
The 30th.
Thank you.
All right.
Merry
Well, good to see you all.
Christmas.
We're taking next week off.
Merry Christmas.
We'll see
Merry
you on the
Christmas,
30th,
everyone.
and we'll dive into
See you
Samuel
Sunday.
then.
Okay.
So, or Sunday. We'll see you Sunday.
Yeah.
Or
Yes.
Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Good night.